Well, hi everyone. I'm Tom Wormuth. I'm Vice President for Academics here at Marist College, as well as Director at Hudson Rhode Island Institute here at the college. I want to take this opportunity to welcome everyone here today to the Woodstock Conference, right here in the historic Hudson River Valley, where the concert was actually held, as we enter into part two of the conference. Part one, for many of you, started with the field trip to Bethel Woods, the original site. I hope it was enjoyable. I know it was informative. I know Wade does a great job over there, and I'm glad that we're able to link that in as part of this remembrance of that important concert 50 years ago. Now, I'm a historian by trade, and so I do have to say a few words. Not one of the 1960s or of Woodstock, though, a much different time period. Like most historians, we tend to think that the time period that we study is the most important. I'm a colonial historian, and why wouldn't I think it's the most important if that's what I study? And probably a lot of other folks would say similar things about their own time periods. However, virtually all U.S. historians would agree that there was no decade the equal of the 1960s in terms of the incredible social and cultural ferment of the social and political protest, of the incredible amount of challenges to traditional authority and changing mores that took place during the course of that decade, culminating ultimately in its most symbolic event, the Woodstock concert. Think about all the things happening during the course of the 1960s, the rise of the counterculture, the emergence of the feminist movement, of the movement of the civil rights movement to the Black Power movement, all of these many different aspects, youth culture, the way that youth changed in terms of their beliefs, their relationship to their family, the way they dressed, they wore their hair, the music that they listened to, all of this components of the decade of the 1960s. And all of these things are, as you would see in your conference program, part of this conference. Obviously, Woodstock is the keystone, and many of the papers and sessions are on the concert itself. But many of the other sessions during the course of today and tomorrow, of course, looking at all of these many other social components to this 1960s, this decade of the 60s, and how this helped to inform what ultimately ended up in the Woodstock concert. What I would also say is and as we start to open up this session here, is, by the way, this was not the official introduction. I need to tell you that. This was just I just couldn't imagine getting up here and not saying a few words. The official welcome, the official introduction will be a little later tonight before the keynote at 7 o'clock. President Yellen will be delivering that at that time. However, the point I was going to make was that all the things I was just describing, whether it's Woodstock itself, all the things leading up to it, how could any of it have happened without the Vietnam War, the rise of the counterculture, and the anti-war movement? It's really central to just about every one of the other social movements I described as well. It was really pivotal in terms of displaying the relationship of people to each other and to the government and to protest. And we thought it was important that that be really the opening session that we have here this afternoon. Now, I do want to take just another moment before handing it over to Dr. Baer, who will be the chairperson of this session, and thank the other groups involved in putting on this conference. Obviously, the Hudson River Valley Institute here at Marist College, under James Johnson, Andy Villani, Chris Pozlowski, they did the lion's share of the work in organizing all today and tomorrow, and did a great job, only a few hours into the conference so far, but a great job as they always do. But I also want to thank our other partners, the New York State Museum, the Office of State History, I see Jennifer Lamack there, Devin Lander, the New York State historian, I know I was speaking to right down here up front, and also our partners at the museum at Bethel Woods, the original site, of course, of Woodstock, and Wade Lawrence, the director there, for all the work that they did in helping to put this conference together. On that note, in order to get the academic and scholarly component of the conference underway, I want to hand this over to Dr. Kristin Baer, professor of history. She's actually an Asian historian, a historian of Asia by training, which actually makes perfect sense in the context of the session we're doing here. Dr. Baer, and again, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, so I teach all of the classes on Asian history at Marist, but I'm also a military historian. So I teach a class on the Vietnam War, that's taught from the perspective of both the Vietnamese and the Americans. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here chairing this panel. I'm very happy to open this conference with this first session, the Vietnam War and the Peace Movement. And we have three presenters here. The first is Robert Brigham from Vassar College, and his talk is titled The Vietnam War Revisited. Then we'll hear from Jeff Jones, anti-war activist, environmental strategist, and consultant. And he will be talking on Woodstock, Vietnam, and the movement. And then we'll hear from James R. McDonough, whose talk is titled The Other Side of the Hill. We organized this as spotlights about the Vietnam War and the movement and its relationship to Woodstock, with the idea that after our presenters spotlight their experiences and research, that we'll have a conversation. So not only those of you who were at Bethel Woods and presumably took in a lot of the relationship represented in that museum between Woodstock and the war and the anti-war movement, but also the rest of you in response to some of our presenters. So I would like to start with Robert Brigham, please.
Yeah, I'll stay here if you don't mind. It's a little less formal, even though we're kind of formal at Vassar. This is across town, so you're good. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I wish you all well during this conference and hope to learn a lot and have good conversations. In preparation for my talk, The Vietnam War Revisited, I went back and looked at the nature of the scholarship at the time of Woodstock. What were people writing and saying about Vietnam? And to try to see how that held up over time as we've had new sources and new interpretations and new methodologies. And so rather than give kind of a standard academic talk, what I thought I would do is run you through from August 1969 to the present day and talk to you a little bit about where the scholarship was and where it is now and what we think we know and what we still don't know and what we can challenge. The minute Woodstock happened, the most critical book on the Vietnam War, probably then and today, was published. It was by George McTeague and John Lewis. It was called The United States in Vietnam, published in August of 1969. It was very critical of the war. It was the first real writing we had from scholars who knew something about Southeast Asia. Kahan was trained as a Southeast Asianist. And in saying that, what I mean by that is he actually took the Vietnamese seriously. He took the Vietnamese as participants in their own history, not just passive actors. And he set a very high bar, I think, in the scholarly world in looking at Vietnam. And we really didn't catch up to him, I think, until about 5 or 10 years ago. He really was so far out in front of other scholars doing work on Vietnam that he really set the standard. I should say in that same month, my mentor, George Herring, who's written a kind of definitive synthetic book on Vietnam called America's Longest War, he published his very first piece on Vietnam. It was an essay on the Battle of the Ai Giang Valley, which has been sort of celebrated in Joe Galloway and Hal Moore's book, We Were Soldiers, Lunch and Young. It's a horrible movie, but the book's interesting. And to think that when Woodstock was taking place, George Herring was the dean of scholars on the American side of the war, was writing his very first piece on the Vietnam War. It will tell you where the scholarship really was at that point. What we've kind of developed since Herring and Kahan started us off in 1969, I'm going to touch on a variety of topics to show you the evolution of scholarly thinking. And the first is that there's not a Vietnam War. I think this is the trouble that Ken Burns ran into in his documentary, that he tried not to have an interpretive arc, he tried not to have professional scholars give him beginning, middle, and end. Instead, he had all these vignettes. And what I took away from that experience, even though a lot of my friends were consultants on that, was that These vignettes really show that there were many Vietnam Wars, not just a single experience. If you were with McPhee from 1955, or its precursor to 1965, you were an officer, you were an advisor, you had that kind of experience. And then from 65 to 68, it was an Army infantry war. And the Marines are up in I-Corps, and they're not as involved in the southern reaches. And then it becomes an air war, so you're back to officers. And so you get a kind of a weird arc on Vietnam experiences, which makes the history, I think, go in this kind of weird arc as well. You can't talk about a particular specific consensus-driven Vietnam experience from the American side or the Vietnamese side. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. When Woodstock happened, the Pentagon Papers hadn't been released yet. They were still a research project. And so much of what we know from the decision-making up to 1968 about the Vietnam War really got traction with the Pentagon Papers, despite their many faults in documentation and analysis. That wasn't a resource that students and protesters and others interested in decision-making and how we got into South Vietnam would have been available. Presidential libraries hadn't really done much work in declassifying their information. It was 1971 when the Lyndon Johnson Library in the archival form began its massive declassification of documents. But from a professional historian standpoint, there wasn't much documentation there. There really wasn't. So it's really interesting to think how much Vietnam really resonated with college-age students, and yet how little documentary evidence there was outside of personal experiences to provide you kind of a narrative framework for what was going on. And that's not even talking about the Vietnamese. I mean, we had Kayen's brief introduction into the Vietnamese, but then we had a 20-year march through the desert where we really didn't do much work with Vietnamese sources at all. And it's the pioneering work of many Vietnamese writers who started to bring Vietnam and its complexity into our view. Bao Ninh in his infamous now Star of War, Le Minh Q, who was an officer in the People's Army of Vietnam, Dung Thu Hung, who was a woman who participated in both Cambodia and the China campaigns after the war. She wrote some very powerful works talking about the Vietnamese leadership during the revolution and how they too had feet of clay. And then on the American side, we had a whole host of veterans beginning to write both affirmatively and critically of their Vietnam experiences. Wayne Carlin, Bill Earhart, Larry Rotman, and a whole host of others. To me, the two it happens to be a husband and wife team that brought this kind of together for us as intellectuals and people interested in Vietnam were David and Mai Elliott. David Elliott was Charles Elliott's son. Charles Elliott was Henry Kissinger's advisor at Harvard and was a true believer in the Cold War. David followed in his footsteps, joined the Army, became an officer, went to Vietnam, and I wouldn't say disillusioned is the right word, but critical became the right word. He ended up working for Rand, and he met Mai Elliott, who was a Vietnamese national, and was doing translations for them. And then they began to use their language skills to show us what the revolution really was about. And it's their work, I think, that brought us to a point where we could, with some confidence, talk about a whole history of the Vietnam War. David Elliott has a 2-volume history called The Vietnamese War, and it's absolutely brilliant in its detail and in its ability to present an interpretive art. I would say that the state of scholarship today is really interesting. If you are a reader of fiction, and you look at the prize winners, you're reading people who were born in Saigon and emigrated as young children here, fled Vietnam, and grew up in the United States, and are now writing prize-winning books. And they're thinly veiled discussions about their status as refugees in the United States, and they're critical of everything. They're kind of like a third wave. They're critical of the Saigon government and critical of the communists and critical of Americans that weren't accepting. And of course, these are people like Viet Thanh Nguyen, whose book, The Sympathizers, won the Pulitzer Prize, Andrew Lam's book, Andrew Pham's book, Catfish and Mandela, and just a wonderful graphic novelist named Thi Bui, who's written some really powerful works recently, and she's won all sorts of awards that have Vietnam as a backdrop, but don't stop there and keep going. And finally, let me say that the exciting new work being done, I think, on Vietnam is the kind of social histories. One of our participants, Beth Bailey, is working on race in Vietnam, and Heather Sturr at the University of Southern Mississippi has done some really interesting and fascinating work on gender in Vietnam. Former West Point Colonel Greg Daddis is working on kind of social constructions of manhood in Vietnam. So there's really, it's fertile ground and it's very, very exciting. I'm not sure people from 1969 who kind of got frozen there in their time frame intellectually would recognize a lot of the scholarship. But it is fertile ground, and it opens up a lot of discussions about this country and how it goes to war and America's place in war, and about the Vietnamese and their revolution. And I think we're getting mature enough in the scholarship to be critical at times when we need to be critical at times of some of the things on the Vietnamese side as well. And just let me end by saying, and then of course we're looking at subaltern voices in the Vietnam War, and we're looking at non-traditional sources to help us tell the story. And I don't mind sharing this here. I just recently found out through a DNA test a father I never knew who was a Marine combat photographer in Vietnam, and his photos are the only record we have of a very famous week for the Marines, first week in February in 1968 in Hue. There were no officers in Alpha 11, and my father was their Marine combat photographer there, and so his photographs tell us that story. And so scholars are starting to look more and more to the kind of subaltern sources, photographs, diaries, letters. There's a beautiful, beautiful diary of a Vietnamese communist nurse attached to a People's Army unit called Last Night I Dreamed of Peace. And I use that every time I teach my Vietnam War class. Absolutely beautiful. And it's got a fascinating backstory. Anyway, for me, as a Vietnam War scholar, this is an exciting field that never stops growing, and it's a big tent, and we have room for everybody in it. So come along. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Hi, everybody. Really happy to be here. Start off by saying I will bring down the quality of the crowd in the sense that I'm not a scholar. I'm an activist. I joined the anti-war movement at a demonstration in Cincinnati, Ohio on October 16th, 1965, during the first international days of protest against the Vietnam War, and I never looked back. And I'm going to tell you a few of my stories and interweave them a little bit with Woodstock. I was at Antioch College in Ohio. I went to several anti-war demonstrations over a while, and then I became the regional director, organizer for Students for a Democratic Society in New York City in April of 1967. I dropped out of college, and I really never went back. So, really, no claims to scholarship, but I do have a lot of experiences that I think are relevant, and I'm not going to argue with the premise of this conference that in 1969 Woodstock changed the world. I think it did. The scope and scale of the festival mark it as an event worth this kind of attention. I also think the conference is right to start with a discussion of Vietnam. For many, and maybe most of the people who came to Woodstock, and maybe here too, but who came to Woodstock, it was about peace and love, and music. It was also a statement, a counter-cultural response to a decade of civil rights struggles, urban riots, black liberation, and a war that, unimaginably at the time, was still only half over. And can I just ask how many people here were at Woodstock? All right. And, cool. Because I wasn't. I'm not sure the organizers of the conference knew this when they first invited me, but they do now, and they still let me come. I did not go to Woodstock, but that's part of my story. I was sitting in the New York City office of Students for a Democratic Society. We had just become, by the way, within the year around leading up to Woodstock, the largest student organization in the history of this country. And several of us were planning what to do for the weekend. We had a choice. We could go to a music festival in upstate New York. It sounded interesting. It sounded to us like it would probably be something like one of the be-ins that we'd been involved in, that had swept across the country starting in about summer of '65. Or we could go, well, if we went, and some of my friends did go, by the way, and hand out leaflets and organize against the draft. But the alternative for me was to fly to Louisiana to attend a Southern Regional Anti-War Conference at Tulane University, a place I'd never been. And that's what I chose to do. I took my first visit to New Orleans and learned something about organizing against the war in the South. Why did I make that choice? For me, 22-year-old in 1969 who had already spent 4 years working against the war, Vietnam was the consuming issue. The criminal policy of a criminal administration and the opposite of what I thought this country should stand for. I saw the world through the lens of Vietnam. Today I see the world through the lens and perspective of climate change and climate justice, which to me is not that different. In November 1967, backing up just a little bit from Woodstock, I was one of 4 anti-war activists invited to visit Hanoi by the North Vietnamese Student Union. It was an exciting and challenging trip. Had we succeeded, we would have been the 3rd group from the United States to make it to the North during the war. We flew to Paris, we met with Vietnamese students there, and then on to Phnom Penh, Cambodia, where we were scheduled to board an International Control Commission flight to Hanoi. But at the North Vietnamese consulate, we were told that the U.S. had begun bombing Hanoi, something the Johnson administration was denying, and that they could not guarantee our safety. The trip was off. We argued, we wanted to take the risk, but they said no. So we met local representatives of both the North Vietnamese government and the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. We had some adventures. We attended a performance by an NLF guerrilla theater group. You've heard of guerrilla theater. This was real guerrilla theater. And they had been operating in liberated zones in the South. And we took a side trip to the temples and the ruins at Angkor Wat. But after about 10 days, we came home. I was anxious to get back to New York City to be part of the upcoming Stop the Draft Week. Going home for a quick family visit in Southern California. However, I saw an article in the LA Times about our trip. It was in response to an SDS statement. It quoted the State Department saying that there were no bombings of Hanoi taking place. According to the Johnson administration and the State Department, we had been turned back as a propaganda stunt. We didn't believe it, but we went back to our work. To the extent that anyone was paying attention, that's where the story stood until about 2 years later with the release of the Pentagon Papers, and it was right there. Secret bombings of civilian areas of Hanoi had begun. I had had a direct experience with one of our government's lies about the Vietnam War. Woodstock predated the release of the Pentagon Papers, as Robert said, by a few months. But it came more than a year after the Tet Offensive, the watershed event in the Vietnam War that turned a majority of U.S. public opinion against it. Mainstream journalists, like Walter Cronkite, declared the war unwinnable after Tet. Shortly before his assassination in April 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King came out against the advice of other leading civil rights movement leaders, condemned the war, and called it part of the same system that oppressed black people in this country. President Johnson saw that his great society was being ripped apart by the war and announced that he would not run again. That opened the door to Richard Nixon, who spent his time in office expanding the war, raising the death toll for U.S. soldiers by tens of thousands and of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians by millions. With this backdrop, I don't regret my decision to spend Woodstock weekend working against the war. Had I gone, I probably would have reacted like my friend Abby Hoffman. You've heard of Abby, right? One of the founders of the Yippies. Abby was a committed, emotional, cultural revolutionary. We knew each other and stayed friends throughout his journey, which included nearly a decade as a federal fugitive. But at Woodstock, Abby was flipping out. So many people, so much counterculture, but where was the movement? Was this a rock concert or a gathering of the tribes? Where were people being mobilized to work to end the war, support black liberation, and make a revolution? Since I wasn't there, I don't know exactly at what point he jumped on the stage. I heard he attempted to speak to the crowd, was told to beat it, jumped off the stage, and stormed back home to the Lower East Side. So I'm looking forward to continuing the now 50-year-old discussion about Woodstock and what it was, the ongoing debate, frankly, on whether it represented some kind of high-water moment in the political movement of the 60s, or a cashing in by some creative entrepreneurs and the loss of innocence. I believe both sides of the debate are true to some extent. What is most important about Woodstock was the scale, the number of young people who came, looking for something different, for a way to live a life of peace and change. And if nothing else, it was a way for many, and excuse me, to say, fuck you to Richard Nixon, J. Edgar Hoover, General Westmoreland, and corporate America, and its corporate ties to the war machine. And even though I wasn't there, I can draw on my own family experience. While I was flying to New Orleans for the anti-war conference, my brother, the lead guitarist of a Southern California rock band, and his buddies were driving nonstop across the country. Somehow he made it to the show, lived in the music and the mud for 4 days, and then drove nonstop back to LA. He's a wonderful man who spent his life teaching music in public schools in Los Angeles and Columbus, Georgia. And I can't resist telling my favorite secondhand Woodstock story. Shortly after my family moved to Albany in 1986, we became friends with a woman named Suzette Quarles, an African-American who was a colleague of my wife working at the New York State Court of Appeals. Suzette was from Jamaica, Queens, but she had a country house in White Lake. She wasn't planning to go to the festival, but because she was local, she was able to get through some of the roadblocks. The show was underway, the crowd was growing, and she was driving through the traffic when she saw a tall, lanky young black man walking along the road carrying a guitar. She figured no one else is going to give this guy a ride. So she did. And that's how Jimi Hendrix got to the show in time to perform the Star-Spangled Banner, probably the greatest single solo guitar riff in the history of rock and roll. I'd like to begin to conclude back here at Marist. I have a good friend in Albany named Bernie Mulligan. Maybe some of you know him. We do work together in Albany on a range of issues. He was a freshman here in August of 1969. I don't think he went to Woodstock, but he threw himself into the anti-war movement, and he shared some of his experiences with me when he heard about this presentation. He describes Marist when he arrived here as, quote, a traditional campus that was feeling the winds of change sweeping across the country. By the time he got here, many of his high school friends had been shipped off to Vietnam, and I identify with that. Graduating from a Los Angeles high school in 1965, I realized some years later that just shy of 10% of my male classmates in that year's spring graduating class had been killed in Vietnam. Excuse me. Bernie says moratorium day in October '69 was huge here on campus in Poughkeepsie. Hundreds of students marched from Marist to join Vassar and New Paltz students at a City Park rally in downtown. A few years later, there was what Bernie describes as a massive shutdown, that's what he called it, on the campus after the National Guard killings at Kent State and then the Jackson State killings. This was happening across the country. Bernie writes, a busload of Marist students went to D.C. the weekend after the Kent State shootings. We were pretty scared. Many of us had written goodbye letters to our parents and left them in our dorm rooms. We were involved in some scuffles and got tear gassed, but all of us came back home and then scattered for the summer. I've got more to say, but I'll leave it with this question for now. What lesson did our government learn from the Vietnam War? Ending the draft is one. When you wage an unjust, immoral, and imperial war and have a system that forces young men involuntarily to fight, you run the risk of losing control of the military. And to a significant extent, that is what happened in Vietnam. The cultural movement that showed up at Woodstock in August 1969 reflected it. The other is the need to understand the impact of relying on a compromised media. to cover our country's wars and invasions. The role of an independent media is critical. True. True revealing stories about the Vietnam War were available in the media back then because reporters risked their lives to get stories independent of the military and the Nixon and Johnson administration's attempts to control the message. But by the time of the first Iraq War, the mainstream media was embedded, allowed to come along to cover the war with the permission of the Pentagon. This is the dominant policy today, and it is wrong. It's a topic for a whole conference, but I'll just say this. Hopefully you have heard of Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. Both are in or threatened with jail at this moment. They, along with others, are whistleblowers. Chelsea is being pursued because she released the true story of the slaughter of Iraqi civilians by an out-of-control U.S. military unit. Julian Assange, whatever else he did, and WikiLeaks published the details. It's a true story, and they are being prosecuted for telling the truth. So if the organizers of Woodstock 4 are successful at pulling off another festival this summer, I hope they include space for the activists of today: anti-war, LGBT, women's rights, climate justice, what I call war and warming. We're still fighting the system. Build the resistance. Thanks for listening.
You and I are playing a game with each other.
While Dr. Bayer's getting me set up, I thought I'd start talking. We would give it 15 minutes. I'll try to stay with it.
So they were doing pretty well on time, so
Good.
you're pretty safe. Okay,
Good,
so
very
that
good.
one will advance it to next.
Very good. I'm Jim McDonough, and I want to tell you, as the title goes, the other side of the hill. Let me begin with my heritage. My grandparents, both sides, came from the old country. On one side from Ireland, the other side from Italy. They came here because they love this country, and they brought me up to love it as well. They went on and on forever. They were always working, people working very hard. The jobs they had, two of my grandfathers were taxi cab drivers, and one of them was a taxi cab driver and later a garbage man, all in New York City. The family never left New York City. The Italian side gave birth to several young ladies, one of which was my mother. And the Irish side had a whole bunch of young men, as well as two young ladies, one of the brothers being my father. When World War II broke out, he was drafted, but and as he went into the Army, he married my mother, and I was born, my mother said, 9 months to the day after he came back from the war. So you see, the heritage was all about country. Both sets of parents and grandparents always talked about their love of the country. My father, as well as my wife's father, who I'll mention a little bit more about, also World War II veteran, stayed in the military. He, by the way, my wife's father, volunteered for service 7 days after Pearl Harbor. He was accepted, but he was only 15, so they held off in accepting him about 4 more weeks until he was 16. And he was among the first to go overseas. He served China, Burma, India theater, my father in the European theater. Both got out after the Army, but both came back in. And so years later, I met my wife, who's present here. And the big event for us in the summer of 1969 is we got married. Some 50 years ago, now a few days. So we're delighted, both of us, to be here to tell you about the other side of the hill. All of this, of course, caused me to get drawn towards love of country, patriotism, a sense of obligation, and really a sense of duty. I tried to get into West Point when I graduated in 1964 from New York City, public school system, but I didn't make it that first year. I went to Brooklyn Polytechnic, part of the New York State system. Good school, and I gained a lot from it. And when the Marines were entered into the war in the late winter, early spring of 1965, that sense of duty caused me to go down to the recruiting office and volunteer to enlist. There was a draft, of course, but I didn't want to wait. I felt if the country's at war, I should do my duty. Nothing in there drove me towards the glory road, it was just a sense of duty, sort of a heritage, love of country. If the country was going to war, my place would be there with them. While I was in the process of doing that, I was notified my competition for West Point had been successful, and I would enter into it in the class of 1965. Excuse me, I would enter in 65, class of 69. Hence the title of their class of 69. So just a few bits about that. Of course, right down the river, winter time, that's me as a plebe. That's me as a boxer. Of course, remember, I'm from Brooklyn, so you got to be a boxer. For my company at West Point. And that's my graduation picture. Now, when I graduate, I have lots of choices to do. I stood relatively high in the class, and I could easily have avoided the war. But I thought, no, my duty now is to serve. I owe my country that much. They've made this big investment in me. So I volunteered in succession for the infantry, and I volunteered for first duty in Vietnam, in my case with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, a separate brigade, which actually was the most blooded unit in Vietnam. And I knew that, and my wife knew that when I volunteered for that unit. And so, off to war. Vietnam, of course, you know that. I was assigned to the 173rd, I said, then running a sort of peacekeeping, village control, protection mission in Binh Dinh province. So Binh Dinh province is shown here on this map, and my particular platoon, a separate platoon, away from its company, was assigned the protection of the village of Trung Lam. Trung Lam is so small it doesn't show on a map, so I had to pencil it in. About 3,000 meters from the South China Sea, and it kind of looks like this. That's a view of the terrain to the south. You can see there's a helicopter coming in there, landing zone. If you look closely at the picture, there's a belt of barbed wire out there, and of course you're looking at a trench line with a fighting position in the corner there. We expected to be attacked, and we were attacked, and we were attacked often. But this is, I wanted to give you a view of the terrain. You can see the mountains in the distance. That's us in Vietnam. That's the village of Trung Lam. This is taking a look. This is generally to the northeast. And you can see now a closer view of the perimeter of the platoon itself, with not only the wire outside the outer bank, but the concertina wire on the inner bank, and then the claymore mines that are situated behind those sandbags. Claymore mine in front of the sandbag. Sandbag there is to guard against the backlash. We had 52 of those claymore mines out. In the event of a last-minute attack, you blew them and hoped you were able to fight out of it. Another view of the village, now looking directly to the northwest here, pretty thin here, and in the middle of our position, for some reason, this large bamboo tower. I wondered, when you get there, a platoon leader always takes charge right away. There are no other officers around, I'm it. And I just saw that as, wonder why they put that up, and after the first water attack, I realized it was an aiming stake for the enemy, so I quickly had it chopped down. So you assert yourself immediately when you make a decision to act on it. I wanted to talk about the village people a bit. The size of the village varied, sometimes a couple of hundred, sometimes a few more hundred. It was like a wave. It had to do with what was going on, what were the forces compelling them to get into the village, out of the village, what the enemy was compelling them to do, what we wanted them to do. But no matter how it went, the children were always drawn to the soldiers. That's, of course, me. Behind me, there's, oh, look at that, the soldier's got his two fingers up. Isn't that the V sign, something to do with Woodstock? Actually, these soldiers always, it was their way of jibing those that didn't come to Vietnam. They never lost an opportunity to cite peace, show the V sign. Their spirit was there, but they were in the war. And I would come back, I knew they were in the war, And one of the reasons why I felt it my obligation to be there, they needed someone to be there with them. The average age of the young soldiers, other than the older NCOs and the guy like me, I'm the old man as the lieutenant, the average age about 19, maybe 20, early probably 19. Some of the soldiers 18, a couple actually were underage at 17. Very young, they were drafted, most of them, but these men were volunteers. They're in an airborne unit. You're in an airborne unit, you've got to volunteer to be an airborne unit. It means you're a paratrooper, you jump out of planes. No jumping in Vietnam, save one time for the 173rd. It was a ground war, and we were in that war. You see more of the children, 2 soldiers there. I forget, I don't remember what reason brought them down there, but typical, as soon as the soldiers went into the village, they wanted to see them. Now, the children were truly affectionate with these soldiers. Soldiers would get candy from the States and little toys and pass them out. Soldiers liked the children. Ironically, some of the children are the children of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. And we had, at this time, 1970, about as many North Vietnamese in this province as we had Viet Cong. And I have some data on that if you care to know about it. But what I'm going to tell you is sometimes the children were used as tools by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese to plant bombs. And it was very poignant to watch the children when the patrol came back in. If they noticed 1 or 2 soldiers were missing, it meant they were dead or badly wounded, otherwise they would have come back with us. And they would cry. And why they cried and planted those bombs was really something in human nature very hard to figure. Something their parents told them to do, made them do, perhaps coerced them into doing. But that was the reality of this terribly confusing war. I wanted to show you this picture of the village elder. He's the mayor of the village. You didn't see many adult men there that weren't very old or very young. Most of the population were the women, the mothers, the elderly women, and the very elderly men. Other than that, they weren't there, with the exception of officials like this village chief. The village chief was Chung Long. When I first met him, he had been wounded already and survived 7 times. Remember, Americans are in and out for a year. They're there. They're representing the government. They're taking a great risk. The province I was in Binh Dinh, had the highest number of assassinations by the enemy of government officials in all of Vietnam. If you piled up the assassinations, the kidnappings, and the terrible woundings, and I've got the data, it goes several thousand. So high stakes. The village chief actually was shot at the village wall while I was there. He was shot by an 8-year-old boy. So as the village chief was washing himself, the boy pumped about 3 rounds into him and stepped over to kill him, but the village chief had a little pin flare on him and he pulled it out just in time to shoot the boy. Pin flare was a signal flare. It's actually a small round with a pretty much a handheld cocking mechanism, hit the firing pin, shot the boy. The boy lived, but it stopped him from killing the chief. When I left, the chief had not returned yet. Well, while we were there, the village got hit a number of times, and a number of times we tried to rebuild it. And I mean hit not by us, just by the enemy. They were trying to get us, but if they failed to get us, they would get the village. But when they happened, they would send out, the Vietnamese government would send out developers to bring it back. This man and the woman behind him, allegedly husband and wife, he was the chief of the 17 revolutionary developers that I was to protect in the enclave of my perimeter. Actually, I didn't know when I took the picture he was Viet Cong. And one night he crept into our ammo bunker with the notion to wrap it with detonation cord and blow it. We caught him. Since he was in the ammunition bunker, we didn't shoot him outright. It might have blown the whole bunker. So we pulled him out, and as I questioned him, he tried to cut my throat with a razor blade he had on his palm, and I hadn't caught it. We secured him and sustained an attack shortly thereafter. The plan must have been to blow the ammo, which would put a gaping hole in our perimeter, then attack. The plan didn't work, we held out. These are National Police from Vietnam coming in. They would come out on occasion. They were not with me. They were coming here this particular day to question a Vietnamese family we picked up. Because of the village, the idea is you came into the village at night, but occasionally as we would patrol, we patrolled several times a day and night, you would find a family out there in the middle of nowhere, and so our standard operating procedures gather the family up, walk them back into the perimeter, let officials know that there was a new family in the area, and then these guys were called, they would come out and question. This particular occasion, they began to torture the family by beating the feet of the mother of the children and the elderly man and elderly woman, probably her mother and father with them as well. I stopped them from doing that so they would not continue, and I chased them away. I want to show you the soldiers. Here we just have a simple picture of an experienced soldier in the raw showing a new soldier how to use the anti-tank weapons, light anti-tank weapon. It was also used for busting bunkers. We did not stay on the defense, by the way. We patrolled every day, as I was describing, generally 3 times a day, and occasionally would mount major attacks by joining with other units and going after the enemy. This is the Kit Carson Scout. Kit Carson Scouts were former Viet Cong that came over of their volition to our side. This man's name was Nan. Nan was an old man here. He's 40 years old or so. Nan, who had been a Viet Cong, absolutely hated the Viet Cong. He never went into his reasons for hating the Viet Cong, but he was very serious about his work. I'll leave it at that. Ask me any questions if you want. The platoon sergeant, in his helmet, he is carrying a string of pin flares. This is what the village chief used, one of these, to shoot the boy that was trying to kill him. The platoon sergeant talking with a squad leader. Your hierarchy is in the platoon: platoon leader, platoon sergeant, squad leaders, and then soldiers. There were 3 squads in the platoon. The platoon, by the way, it's supposed to number 43, but because of lack of support for the war, because of casualties, our numbers were down around 21, 20. A very critical number, probably not enough to do what we had to do. For example, the night of the attack, where I told you the Viet Cong was trying to blow our armor dump, we had about 20 men. I lost 6 men in the first probably 3 or 4 minutes. So my estimate, I try not to inflate these things. By this time I had an experienced eye for it. But you count guns, my estimate was about 125 trying to take the position. So you see how lopsided it gets when you're under strength like that. So the relationship was critical in how you did these things between people like the platoon sergeant and the squad leader. In another attack, we were almost wiped out. This is an armored platoon. You're seeing the Sheridan tank there. It came out in the middle of the night. Without that, I don't think we'd have made it through the night. It was led by my classmate, Terry O'Boyle. Heck of a job coming through. This is under fire, getting in there. Of course, he has heavy armor, but he got in there. Terry was killed shortly after this picture was taken. That's his tank. Just a soldier cleaning his weapon after a fight. You can see one of the positions. That's more a shelter position than a fighting position when the mortars came in. This is a platoon ready to getting out. Now, again, this is a squad. That's a squad. Average age, as I said, 19. They're loaded to the gills. This place is booby-trapped out to kazoo. I hit a booby trap on my 3rd patrol. And whenever you went out during the day, it would try not to step on the booby traps. They were everywhere. It's like walking through minefields. It got much more difficult at night. But if you didn't go out at night, the enemy would come up and get you where you were. You had to send patrols out to keep them off of you at night. They were good at massing action against us if we got passive. And show you a close-up of how young they were. These are two buddies. They're changing over as radio men. Radio, the RTO we call it, radio telephone operator, had a very difficult job. The enemy was very savvy, always is very savvy. He was a very hardened enemy. They knew that the two people you had to get was the radio telephone operator. He's the guy that would call for everything the platoon leader told him to get. The other guy was the platoon leader. Now the platoon leader gets kind of mixed in the dark especially. You can't see who's giving the orders or yelling, but you can always see the silhouette of the radio on the man's back and that long antenna going up. Just to give an idea how it goes, the guy on the right without the shirt he survived the war, was wounded 3 times, badly wounded, but kept coming back. Fun-loving guy. They were the same 2 guys later, in a different pose, different location. We're up in the hill. We're up in the hills a bit. Unflappable. You had to love these soldiers. They're part of the war machine that was mentioned. They were not war machine. These were young kids. They were doing their job as their country told them to do it. They slept in the mud a few days too, by the way. Monsoons. They never came out of the field. It's not like you see today when you go out and you come back and you take a shower. They lived in the field, and they fought hard, and the enemy fought hard. That's me one more time. That's a strong point. The platoon was located in a triangle. The idea is to put your strong points at the corners of the triangle. You always had a machine gun there, so if the enemy attacks, you interlock the machine gun blast. And it's evening here. It's a terrible photo, I know, but I want to show you this one. This is a patrol moving out at night. It would be dark, so they'd set up an ambush. The name of the game at this level is they ambushed us, we ambushed them. Getting caught in an ambush is terrible. You see this aisle here? If you folks here are setting the ambush and you folks here are walking up the aisle, that's when they spring the ambush. And it is everything from claymore mines to machine guns to automatic rifles. And then when they put everyone down, they come out and kill everybody. So this was a bloody war, not our bloodiest of wars, but for those that fought it, it was a very bloody war. It was bloody for both sides, of course, but it's one that was fought all out. I just wanted to share with you sort of the other side of the hill. Thank you.
So you're coming back up, huh? Okay, I would like to encourage everyone once again, those of you who did not heed Colonel Johnson's call to move forward so we could have a more direct conversation. But if you are unwilling, oh, we've got a question already? Oh no, you're gonna run the microphone. Okay. So we'd like to open up the conversation with our participants and the audience. Any questions are welcome, but I think that those of you who were able to go to Bethel Woods today, I'm curious if any of the perspectives that we've seen today resonated with you and the presentation at the museum.
Kirsten, I want to ask a question over here.
Yeah, you can ask a question. Go ahead.
Rob, listening closely to the books that you mentioned, there are some you didn't mention, and they're probably for a good reason. I just want to ask you about them. One was by Douglas Pike. You had said there had been no really serious studies of the enemy, but I thought Douglas Pike had a pretty good insight early in the war and was advising both administrations by the late 60s. His book was War, Peace, and Viet Cong, in which he argued that you couldn't win. North Vietnam was not a normal political entity. It actually was a war machine with a political adjunct to it. I've overstated that, I believe. But that they were prepared to fight it out for as long as it took. So Pike was one We also had the French that had written extensively about it. So Bernard Fall, hell in a very small place, Street Without Joy, and a few others. At the line level, there was a book called Battles in the Monsoon by S.L.A. Marshall that I thought as early as 66, 67 captured, at least on the American side. And then later on, books like Bright Shining Live, pretty much the biography of John Paul Vann, an interesting fellow in Vietnam. Anyway, why did you not include those books?
Because I had 15 minutes. Yeah, literally, because I had a lot of territory to cover, and I wanted to make sure I got the Vietnamese perspective in there, because I think that's what would have been missing in 1969 in the scholarship. Pike's 3 books on the NLF were very good in the sense that he understood, I think better than most, that the revolution was about communicating ideas. And he was a communications expert. And so I think that perspective of Pike's work is really, really valuable for us to see. However, if I were to assign a book in a class on the Vietnam War, and I wanted to make sure I had the Southern Revolution's perspective, I wouldn't use Pike because he didn't understand a lot of the anthropological and deep historical factors that led Southerners inside the party to have a different worldview than Northerners inside the party. But still, his collection that used to be at Berkeley and it's now at Texas Tech is invaluable to Vietnam War historians. And I would encourage people who are interested in researching have to go look at the Pike collection there. Let me see, who else?
I mentioned Fall's work.
Bernard Fall's work is absolutely brilliant as far as it goes. But again, early people, Bernard Fall, Jean-Luc Cotter, they had a view that was informed. Paul Moose, even Francis Fitzgerald, whose book 1971, Fire in the Lake, won the Pulitzer Prize. Their books have a distinctly French overview. They're kind of trapped in Frankie Fitzgerald's very clear about this, that they have a French sociological view of these things. And so if I'm picking like 10 books that I'm going to talk about in the entirety of the 40 or 50 years of scholarship since Woodstock, I'd include those as places to start, but not places to end. By today's scholarship, even Bernard Fall stuff looks standard because it is good for capturing a moment, but there are other writings, I think, from that period even that are significant. Neil Sheehan's book, Bright Shining Light, is a fascinating book about John Paul Vann. John Paul Vann's life, if you don't know his story, I'd recommend you read it. It's really interesting, and I think Sheehan was brilliant in using Vann as a vehicle to tell the story of the changing trajectory and geometry. Vann was very critical of the U.S. effort and the ardent effort at AFBAC in 1963, but Sheehan's argument is he sort of becomes victim to the big talk about big war in Vietnam later on. Outside, Ty, you're gonna have to help me on this. I think this is right. Outside of the Civil War, there are more books published about the Vietnam War than any other topic in American history. So, and it doesn't stop. Every time I think that the student interest or the scholarship is going to wane, it doesn't. Something happens, and some conflict or some generational shift happens. And just to tie something with what Jeff was saying earlier, today's students, I do teach a course on climate change and international security, and today's students, to a student, call it their Vietnam. It's an interesting connection.
Jeff, you want to point to me?
Yeah. We certainly have offered a couple of different perspectives on Vietnam here this afternoon. I had my caveat that not being a scholar, but I just want to say I've read a lot of those books, and I read a lot of books at the time. And the thing that in both lists of books that I've just heard, someone who was very influential to us was the Australian journalist Wilfred Burchett, who was was operating in the liberated zones in South Vietnam and was very credible. And I think to us at the time, and I think his books have stood the test of time. But we also were reading translated Vietnamese books. And I can't remember the names of them, although I have them in a box in my attic. And when I'm downsizing, I have to confront. That's one of the boxes I have to confront. But they were, again, in my experience, they were not, they would have been viewed, could still be viewed by some as propaganda, but they were not, in my opinion, and based on my experience. I spent 3 weeks in Vietnam in 1986. I haven't gone back there since then. It was fascinating because by then the Vietnamese had already fought a border war in the north with China, and they were completely open to, I mean, they liked me because I had been an anti-war activist, but they were open to people from the United States because they were mad at China. And that's things have really moved on. I also always liked the fact that Anthony Bourdain, remember, I don't know if any of you were fans of his show, but and I'm really sorry that we lost him, but just like a couple of years ago, he did a show about Hanoi, his second show, just a food show about Hanoi. And he said that if he couldn't live in New York City, the city in the world that he'd most like to live in is Hanoi. He was just having a great time there. And so one of the tragedies to me of this whole thing is that an opportunity for what are really a couple of interesting countries and interesting cultures was denied to a generation because of policies that I think were reprehensible. And so you've got a couple of different perspectives to think about.
I want to know more about that box of translated works you have in your attic, Chris, as an historian. But I think that's an important point, though, is that a lot of the translated works came from outside of the United States. So Wilfred Burnett would be a good example, right, of somebody from Australia going in through a different avenue, but also French translations of Vietnamese tracts were, I think, available, but it was not from the United States. It came through Europe, right, to get to the United States. That's, I think, a good point.
I think, Robert, I'm wondering about the premise of the Vietnam War. We believed that it was to stop the flow of communism. And first, does that still hold up through your research? Is that really, that's what you told us, but is it really true? And then, can you compare that to the British fighting the Americans to keep America in the Revolutionary War, believing that if they lost America, they would lose their colonies. And then, if you could expand that to what we're doing in the Middle East, if there's any comparison.
Wow. So on the causation, I mean, historians love causation. We love talking about origins, and we love talking about the reason something happened. But history is also an argument without end. And every generation is responsible and required, I think, to look at the evidence and to interpret it in the way that they do. And where we are right now is very complicated on causal properties with Vietnam. The domino theory that dominated the discourse in the 1950s, I mean, I think most scholars looking at the Vietnam War today would say that by the time you got to the Kennedy administration, there really wasn't, even though the Cuban Missile Crisis existed and there were other, the Berlin Crisis, and there were other areas of the world where that theory still dominated, Kennedy, it's pretty clear, no longer believed in a geographic domino theory by the time that his administration came to power. Fred Lobovell, who just won a Pulitzer Prize a couple years ago for his book Embers of War, explored this in his first book called Choosing War. And he makes the argument that this belief that you had to draw the line in Vietnam, it's more complicated than that in the Truman administration. It becomes a thinking, dominant strategic thought in the Eisenhower administration. Kennedy rejects it, and that it's Johnson that brings it back. So, like there's no single event, there's no single administrative view. It's not 5 successive presidents thinking the same way and responding in the same way and having the same strategic outlook. I mean, Kennedy was much, I mean, the $6,000 question, $4,000 question about Kennedy, you know, is he going to get out or stay in? I mean, what we're doing now, what we're seeing in the documents, is that Kennedy actually, that 1,000 troops that McNamara requests, the 1,000 advisors that come home in December of '63 that are scheduled in October, they don't actually come home. They're just reoriented. They go to Thailand. Kennedy's whole vision of maybe we did back the wrong horse in Southeast Asia, but I'm not going to give up the idea of containing China. And so those troops will go to Thailand, they'll go to Indonesia, they'll go... So the grand strategy behind all this, that's stuff that the historians are still fighting out, but the domino theory as the dominant theory that starts with Truman and ends with Gerald Ford, that doesn't hold up as much under scrutiny. And I'm not qualified to talk about the Middle East or almost anything else outside of the Vietnam War, actually. There are people in the room who can.
Go up there and then we'll go back.
I'm thinking that the Vietnam War was a watershed in a different way than anybody's spoken so far. We had a great deal of trust in the government of the United States at that time. What the government said up until the war was, we believed it. In the war, you found that there were body counts. That was my first understanding of, well, you make numbers up to satisfy the folks at home. And then you heard that there was a drug importation into the United States, and we had marijuana that was, we didn't know how to deal with it, we still don't. And that has started something that has been a continual, I can't trust the government, all they do is want money. And that has not changed. I think it was quite active in the last election. You might like to say that mistaken in the way that it happened or happened long before, or totally off base, but anyhow, there was a sea change, I think, in the feeling and thinking and belief of the citizens of the United States. Thank you for listening.
Could you pass the microphone over? Thank you.
I wondered if we could I could talk about what was just mentioned, Dr. Banner.
Yeah, sure, please.
I stayed in the military for almost 30 years. I stayed in Vietnam. I agree that it changed sort of policy outlooks, a great reluctance to get involved abroad. And that may be a good thing, but I can think of two occasions where I wish our political leadership had been more ready to move forward. One would be the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. I will tell you, in my view, the reticence to get involved with that harkens back to Vietnam. It was, you may remember, just a few months before the genocide broke out in April of '94. We had lost a number of soldiers in Somalia.
Black Hawk Down.
So we tried. So we were very reluctant, but by not getting involved, by the way, when we did get involved, I was the leader of the force that went into Rwanda. I was ready to go on April the 6th. I had prepared for it, not expecting the genocide in massive proportions, but I thought we should have went. I reported ready to go, and I was the tagged unit. We did not get committed until late June. At that time, 1 million people had been killed. I think we would have stopped that a lot quicker. Subsequently, we did not go into Bosnia when the Serbs had moved against Srebrenica. Again, I was tagged to lead the unit into Srebrenica to bring out the UN forces that were captured there, being held hostage. We were pulled off, or we were not committed. We were on the verge. I will tell you, we had rehearsed under live fire our move into Srebrenica 24 times. You really get ready for these things. We didn't go in, and we did get the UN forces out through a negotiation. 10,000 Muslim boys and men were slaughtered in the wake of that. So the reticence that comes out of Vietnam to get involved with adventures abroad may be a good thing, but it may also be a bad thing on occasion.
My question deals with the nature of the Vietnamese opposition to American involvement, and also going back earlier to getting rid of the French. In your opinion, was the Vietnamese war a war for national reunification, or was it a war to spread communism in Vietnam?
Well, certainly, in my opinion, it was a war, it was a civil war that we improperly intervened in. And it was an attempt by the part of Vietnamese nationalists to reunify their country that was blocked by the United States. And as they are looking for allies, they turn to communist countries and embrace the communist ideology. So yes, that happened, but it was primarily a nationalist struggle that I have to say, I generally oppose U.S. military intervention, and I feel, but what's the alternative? Is the alternative to not intervene at all, or is the alternative to create an entirely different approach to the way we approach the world through economic development? And we're watching this play out right now at our southern border and in the Middle East. I mean, we are just investing our resources in the wrong way, and we've been doing it basically since we emerged victorious from the Second World War. And that's how I view what happened in Vietnam.
Would you agree that we were wrong in going into Korea in 1950?
Oh yes. A book I would recommend to everyone is I.F. Stone's Hidden History of the Korean War. I'll say this: it's not a clear history when you really drill down. I actually have read a lot of books. You look at Vietnam, the Tonkin Gulf incident, which was the Johnson administration used as an excuse to send troops to Vietnam.
But getting back to the Korean War, do you think that would have been okay if South Korea was now part of the regime that ruling in North Korea?
I don't know that would have been the outcome. I don't accept that as the terms of on which I would debate it. But since I'm still thinking about the world from my perspective, as you clearly are too, what's with these two tankers in the Straits of Hormuz that that no one knows who attacked them, but all of a sudden, I'm not going to be surprised to see the U.S. military on the move, and we're not even going to know why. So stay alert, folks. It's still happening.
I can tell you how scholars think about this, which is very different than the discussion we're having right now, and it's kind of contentious. I would say the dominant view of scholars who have Vietnamese language skills right now, looking at primary archival material, is that you had two entities, one in the south and one in the north, who were more similar in the way that they approached governing their people than they were different. And that it was really a contest about what it meant to be Vietnamese and what it meant to have a different view of the history. And it is very contested right now in scholarly terms. And because for so long the scholarship on Vietnam was really an extension of the war's ideological divide, it's new generations of scholars. When you go to conferences with people with Vietnamese language skills and they present their work and they're talking about the revolution in ways that people aren't my age and our age aren't familiar hearing. It sounds almost like a retrograde discussion, but it's where the scholarship has gone because of language skills and language abilities and really good archives that are opening up. So we're going to have to keep an open mind as we listen to especially the young scholars who are doing some of this really fascinating work.
I think there was a hand in the back before, is that right? Somebody have their hand up in the back? Thanks. This will be our last question.
Colonel McDonough, my one question was to find out if you had been in the military for your career, which you answered. I'm curious though, in looking back, do you think that we resolved, I mean, was it worthwhile being in Vietnam? Do you think that it served its purpose?
Well, it's a good question, and a very fair question. I regretted very much all the lives lost there, including the children I showed pictures of, certainly the soldiers I knew, and the Vietnamese. I also had a respect for the military people, but I do think that we gained time, that there was a period of time when the people in South Vietnam were free. I think the leadership was terrible. I think the leadership of South Vietnam was the wrong team to back, and I hated to be on the team that was, in essence, supporting them. So I really don't agree with all the policy decision made, but I thought it was tragedy when South Vietnam fell to North Vietnam. It was not a benevolent period of time. Peace didn't spring out. You had all of the re-education camps. You had hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese fleeing. Many of those journeys are epic, and I'm sure you all know people that families were separated 10, 15 years. Many died in the aftermath. To answer your question, therefore, I think it would have been better had South Vietnam remained free of North Vietnam's dominance. I think it would have been workable had South Vietnam had proper leadership. Whether or not that could have been done is really the essence of the question. So I want to mention one book that you might want to look at. It's called Losing Binh Dinh, and just a brief note on this. It is really a scholarly work, probably to a fault. It's not an easy read. It's an analytical work that considers all sides' policy and military moves. The author, Kevin Boylan, if I've got it right, was a defense analyst who really was, I think, doing this on his own. A very, very scholarly work, in my opinion. He answers the question this way. He posits it this way. There are two schools of thought. One school of thought, we had the war won in '68, we the Americans, and then we walked away from it. We had it won after Tet, and we walked away from it. Very socially, all of the anti-war movements, politically, congressionally, funding, stop. What I'm talking about, half-size platoons, in many ways, that's a funding issue, it's a social issue. You can't get people to serve. You mentioned that as a culminating point. There's no draft after that. But the other side of the coin was you never could have won it, which was really what Douglas Pike was arguing in the 60s. So Boylan says the problem with these two schools of thought, they're always a top-down look. So he selects Binh Dinh province. That's the province I serve in. That's why he calls it Losing Binh Dinh. And he does it from the bottom up. And it's exhausting. His conclusion, we couldn't win. This was an epical commitment. Whatever it took, all the dying, all the death would not stop. I have not touched on the gore involved. I mentioned some of the casualties. But I will tell you, my view that the North Vietnamese were benevolent, that Ho Chi Minh was only a nationalist, I don't believe that when I came across South Vietnamese civilians carved up, not by Americans, but by the Viet Cong, then heavily infiltrated by North Vietnam. Boylan begins to lay out the total immersion in this one province. And his conclusion, it's not winnable. So back to your question, ma'am. You don't want to get involved in a losing cause. But my long view, remember later on, I'm in Rwanda, which in my opinion is even worse than Vietnam. In life, you buy time for as long as you can. You keep as many people going for as long as you can. When we did get committed to Rwanda, we actually were able to lower the death rate. Not minutely, but grandly. One statement on that, and it does harken back to Vietnam. When we came into Goma, Zaire, the death rate from cholera was 5,000 a day. in a refugee camp of 140,000. 5,000 a day. Within a matter of days, we brought that down to something like 450 a day. Horrific in its own level, but it's a big difference when you have people boil the water and bury the dead. So back to Vietnam, for a number of years from the end of World War II through the evacuation of the French at the end of their war, up until 1975, there is a modicum of freedom in South Vietnam. There's war, there's horror, but there's more horror yet to come. So I don't regret being there. I regret the great loss of life.
Maybe each of you, if you'd like to have a closing comment, yeah, and then we'll close up.
I'd like to go to Woodstock. Enjoy a little peace and love. Yeah, so it's great to spend my adult life having this argument and this discussion. So I'll just pick on one element of what you just said. I'm always uncomfortable when the narrative referring to the people we were fighting against in Vietnam is to call them the enemy, because I don't think they were the enemy, because I don't think we should have been there. But then the next thing that you hear is that we were mostly fighting against North Vietnamese in the south of Vietnam, which is not really accurate. It's accurate in fact, but it doesn't take into consideration things like the Phoenix program and a whole host of government strategies, both by the South Vietnamese government and by U.S. military advisors, not the GIs who are stuck fighting the war, but the systematic elimination of the opposition in the South, so that you can't really accurately describe the situation as one in which people from the North came down to the South. They did at a certain point. We know there was a Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we also know that there were atrocities committed by everyone on every side, because people were losing their minds. And then the other thing about it is now there's starting to be scholarship, because some of the Vietnamese documents are coming out to show that the role of the Le Duc Tho and Le Duan, their leadership of the Vietnamese Communist Party, they were Southerners who went north and basically were leading the Vietnamese Communist Party and pushing for the war to continue in the South. So it's so complicated, and this discussion is going to go on as long as we're around.
It is complicated, it's my day job. And teaching a generation, continually teaching generations that Vietnam might as well be the Peloponnesian Wars, has its challenges, but it also has its rewards. And I just wish you all a good conference, and hope the dialogue continues to be engaging. Thank you.
Thank you very much.